Welcome, I'm Anna Dison. I'm the Assistant Director for the Women in Engineering program, and today we're going to talk about micromessages, a little bit about incivility and some strategies for what we can do. I have some learning outcomes, which is really just to understand what micromessages are and to appreciate the impact that these have. And then obviously our goal is to reduce the frequency of them. And then to talk about some strategies to overcome it when it happens to you, and to possibly intervene when you see or hear it happening to others. Jumping right in, microaggressions are everyday slights, insults, or put downs. These are really invalidating to the person receiving them, and they're offensive to people who are marginalized. And at any given time, any one of us could be marginalized. But we know within STEM that there are some populations that are that don't have a critical mass, that are definitely marginalized, who experience these slights, insults, put downs on a frequent basis. Now, these are things that happen in everyday, daily conversation. They're delivered on an interpersonal level. So these are things that happen either verbally or non-verbally. And we can talk about some examples of those if we need to clarify. They're also delivered through social media, curriculum, which I have some great examples to talk about, definitely TV, mascots, monuments, other symbols, and there's a picture of some that are maybe not so micro with some examples there. So yesterday, actually received an email from a group that is starting to study language that is, or jargon that could be potentially offensive or insulting. And so it made me think about two terms that have been on my mind the last couple of days that are actually microaggressions, because nobody really ever thinks about them. And the first term you may have heard, it's postdoc fellow or postdoctoral fellow. And most people don't think about that one, but fellow tends to refer to a male colleague or a male friend. And so that language is kind of exclusionary. The other term that I submitted to this group is fellowships. So at the graduate level, instead of receiving a scholarship, you receive a fellowship, which comes from that same derivation of the word fellow. So these are simple words that we use that have been in our language, in our jargon for many, many years, that are actually kind of, when you stop to think about it, kind of insulting for people who are not maybe identifying with a particular gender. And so these are why they're micro, right? They're not things that we tend to think about a lot. They occur regularly. And the micro occurs to the frequency that we receive these kinds of messages. It does not refer to them being lesser or insignificant, because they are definitely very significant, particularly when they build up. So there is a difference, really, if you tease down into what these things are. There's a difference between rudeness and microaggressions. So microaggressions are constant and continual for the people who are marginalized. They are cumulative in nature, and they represent a lifelong burden of stress that has built up because of receiving these messages continually. They're constant, continuous reminders of that person or that target's group's second-class status in society. So in the case of a gendered microaggression, it's receiving that message again that women are less than. And they're really symbolic of past governmental injustices. And so you could change the word governmental and insert institutional. There's a lot of oppression that we are starting to really talk more about. And all of these microaggressions are symbolic of those things. So just to be clear, to be marginalized is characterizing a situation where people are on the margins, so sort of on the periphery, based on one or more identities that that person holds. So I'll use myself as an example. Oftentimes when I'm talking to students, a group of students, then I could be marginalized because of my age. So I'm typically older than students. And that can be one of those identities that can put you on the margin. You might not know the newest thing, the newest, set of trends or lingo or jargon. And so there are things that happen when you're on the outside of a group that sort of reinforce you being on the outside of that group. So that's what it means to be marginalized. And we could probably spend a lot of time identifying groups and talking about situations where we have all felt like we were on the margins. So what happens is that these microaggressions and this behavior creates a hostile and invalidating environment. So these are some things that people have heard. They kind of, when you work in this space and you're in it a lot, they don't really seem micro to me. They seem really macro, but by definition, these are micro. So this totality of the environment of these microaggressions is what creates this hostile environment. And it's hostile in terms of educational environment, health, healthcare. There's a lot of this happening. So, we have to start to talk about these, think about them, and start to interrupt the patterns. Now, it's important to think and talk about the racial micro and macroaggressions that are happening to people based on race. If you have an identity that can be hidden, like, maybe first gen or socioeconomic status, you can maybe hide that. You can't hide your skin color. You can't hide your hair color. And so the way that folks who have received racial microaggressions over time describe it as this battle fatigue. It's a constant reminder of a lower social status in our society. And it is a lifelong burden of stress that does not go away. And it is particularly debilitating to our Black, Indigenous, and people of color who face this constant barrage of aggressions. So, we're gonna spend some time unpacking, but let's think about as a group if we have some examples of microaggressions or discriminatory treatments that you all have either experienced or know about. You can just unmute. We're a fairly small group, and throw out your examples.
Okay. Hi, everyone. I'm Samia Siraj. I'm the CEO of A Better Force, which is a leadership and professional development company in Austin, Texas. Some of the examples of microaggressions that I faced very recently was, when talking about race in different conversations. And one of the things that I have always been told when pushing for change is I don't understand American traditions. And even though on the surface of it, it just seems, it can seem harmless. I am an immigrant and I've been in America for about 15 years now. But when you say that, it automatically, to me, it's you're different, you're the other. And the other thing I've also heard is if you don't like it, you can go back to where you came from. And so, and and in those moments, it's very hard to challenge that, especially the second one, you can challenge it, you can challenge it more. But the first one where the implication is, I don't understand the traditions, and therefore I don't understand how hard it is to change a certain behavior. I think that's more difficult to handle and explain. And so that is something that has created, as you were talking about, it's created fatigue, when I hear it again and again.
Yeah, thank you. We do a lot of othering. We other everybody we can into other groups.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Who generally is saying that? Is that someone that you're trying to sell to or get funding from, or casual conversations or competitors?
I think mostly when I've heard that it's been trying to change things at an administrative level, trying to push for more diversity hires, trying to push for more inclusive language. And I think the pushback that I get for things like this is, you don't understand how difficult it is because you don't understand, the traditions that we've come up with.
Yeah, and think about the position you have put someone in. If you're the aggressor, right? If I am saying that to Samya, I'm giving her the message that she can't be her authentic self. She can't then be safe saying she's an immigrant because you don't understand is the response. So we're not allowing people to be their authentic selves because of these biases that we have. And then that forces Samya to not be her authentic self, to hide maybe the fact that she's an immigrant because she doesn't want people judging her or making comments about what she understands or doesn't understand.
Yeah, exactly. Then I have to come up with ways in which my immigrant status doesn't come into the conversation, and so that the burden is not, shifted, to me not understanding instead of actually pushing for change. I know change is difficult, but
yeah, and it becomes an excuse not to do it.
yes.
Well, you don't understand, so.
Yes. I was going to say, I always joke that everything is fair in love and war, and especially in career. And so it sounds like they're looking for an excuse, and one that you can't change, right? You can't undo where you were born. So, hey, I don't have to look at doing change or anything because you've now, there's nothing you can do to solve the problem. And so it's cruel.
So there's a lot of examples of discriminatory treatments that we could unpack, but here's a few, that people have shared. There are some that are, really problematic when you start to dig deeper, particularly as it relates to education and healthcare. We've heard examples of students who have been discouraged from pursuing graduate study based on an identity that they have, or certainly not encouraged. And so these are systemic problems, and they continue to, they can be really micro. They can be really micro, messages that people receive that can change the course of somebody's life. So it's important to understand when and where they happen, and to become sort of hyper aware of when you see them so that you can start to interrupt the messaging. What we know from the research is that ignoring them can be just as detrimental, if not more, to the initial microaggression. So just letting it slide, or just, oh, well, that person's just not very smart, or, they're having a bad day, those are not helpful. It is really important to challenge the messages because the behaviors and words are, described, or they're used as a cover. And so it's important to challenge, well, what did you mean by that? Why do you think I can't possibly understand this culture that I've been a part of? How does birthright factor into understanding? So I mean, there's a lot of ways that you could figure out how do you have that phrase ready. Now, generally, in my experience, when I'm ready to confront a microaggression, it doesn't happen, or there's a different one, and then I'm completely unprepared. So, as prepared as we think we can be, that doesn't always translate. So, there's 5 reasons why people generally don't act, why we don't act when we see these or when we experience them. So this invisibility in this modern form of bias. Now, I will say that over the course of my time working in this space, the invisibility has become way more visible. It has become much more visible and sort of, I don't want to say socially acceptable, but for sure tolerated. So the invisibility is a moving target, I think. So people trivialize the incident as innocuous. They diffuse the responsibility, somehow somebody else said that, or somebody told me that. People don't act because they fear repercussions or retaliation. So there's another level of microaggressions that is fairly new for me in terms of thinking and understanding them, but they're called hierarchical microaggressions. So these could be things that happen in a organization where there is a different dynamics within power structure. So when you have different power differentials, there are hierarchical microaggressions that happen based on power or position. And if you are on the receiving end, you could definitely fear the repercussions of interrupting that or retaliation for pointing that out. For most of us, or if you're like me, then it's really just not really understanding, knowing what to do at all. So this freeze effect of, I don't know what to do. Did that really just happen? Did I hear that right? And so that creates this whole internal dialogue that's going on, this anxiety, this, guilt about something. Maybe you said something and oh God, did they take it the wrong way? This internal dialogue that starts to happen that we all have. And that creates this negative, it's typically a negative self-evaluation and this feeling of hopelessness and helplessness and this sense of resignation. I think most people, when these things happen, continue to ponder them and replay them over in their minds. And that feeds that negative self-talk and that doubt, 12 hours later when you're still processing. So we all do that. In order to create a more inclusive space, we have to be allies, and we have to create allies, and we have to break down these hierarchical structures that support this kind of behavior. And so knowing when you're in a dominant situation, when you're not on the margins, recognizing when you're in the dominant group is super important so that you can be an ally. Because when you're in the dominant group, then you have the best opportunity and the most power to be an ally to someone on the margins. But you have to decide for yourself when and where that is. Is that safe? And all of those things. But step one is to just understand when you're on the margins and when you're in the dominant group, and recognize that for others as well. So there's an acronym. I couldn't remember this for the life of me, so I don't expect you to remember, but we'll share this out. And taking action is kind of where you want to try to be, which is asking those clarifying questions. What did you mean by that statement? Carefully listening to what somebody is saying and the words that they're using when they clarify. Are they trying to justify behavior and cover up, or are they really not very clear about the damage that that statement caused? They could really be ignorant in terms of what that statement means or how it's interpreted. So listening is super important. Telling the other person what you observed in a factual way, so that you're taking the emotion, you're taking the judgment out of it. And exploring the impact. The impact of what we do is so important. And oftentimes impact does not equal intention. So your intention may not be to harm, but that definitely could be the impact. And you have to spend some time thinking about those. And then owning your own thoughts and feelings. Look, we all have bias. We all need to understand what that bias is and where that sort of, when does it come out? When does it affect our thinking? And then own that and start to interrupt it for yourself. And then there's some next steps in taking action, figuring out how do you process the microaggression? How do you manage it so that you can mitigate some of the buildup of many years of feeling them? So the prolonged effects of microaggressions are all of these things. They take a definite toll on each person. Stress, well-being, mental health, all of these things are impacted. What's really fascinating is that when somebody is impacted by microaggressions and their identities being targeted, it really impedes their ability to learn and to problem solve, because the mental capacity that's being used to understand what happened, to process what happened, to deal with those identities is taking up the processing space in your brain, and you're not able to learn or problem solve. So it really impairs performance, and that is not where we want to be if we're trying to create environments where people are solving really complex and important problems. So there's 6 ways to respond. The first is reframe the situation, which is similar to asking clarifying questions. But to reframe the situation, challenge the microaggression. So right out of the gate, you can challenge and, do you understand what you just said? Do you understand how that could be problematic? Let's talk about this, right? You can express your disagreement. Explain why you disagree. Now, for some people, this is important. For other people, explaining is really taxing. And, certainly this list of 6 are not all the things you would do. You might pick one. You might do nothing, which is number 6. You have permission to do nothing to address the microaggression if that's the safe thing to do. Redirecting the conversation might be the appropriate thing to do in that moment. It might be good to revisit it later with the person individually or privately. So, but I think these 6 ways of responding are by no means an exhaustive list, but it gives you at least a starting point of, okay, what should I do in this situation? And so I want to spend just a minute or two talking about the power of microaffirmations. So these are the positive things, because I don't think we spend enough time really engaged in the power that our microaffirmations have. So this is things like greeting the person with sincerity and making eye contact, which, look, on Zoom, that's hard to do, but, smiling and turning your camera on and, trying to be a part of the group and using the person's name, connecting to that person. These are the affirmations that can really change the negative buildup that we encounter. Bringing a personal element. So all of these things happen when we do more listening than we do thinking about what we're going to say next. When you take a step back and you really listen to what the person is saying. So being present for that person and focusing on them completely and using your body language, which again, virtually is hard to do, but you know, there are some things that we can do virtually. Like leaning in still shows that you're interested, smiling and nodding and all of those things. Responding by paraphrasing and empathizing, being curious, asking questions and for input, and then just really appreciating people's strengths and contributions are all the affirmations that I don't think we do enough of collectively. And if we did this more, I think the microaggressions would start to maybe subside, or at least maybe not cause nearly as much harm. So we know that in this pandemic, talking about self-care has been so critical. And I feel that it is a continuous reminder of those things that we need to do to preserve our own mental health and our well-being. So connecting with that supportive network, you know, if you can do meditation, getting enough sleep is so important. You know, nutrition, exercise, avoiding unhealthy conversations and situations. Sometimes it's really, you have to think about the toxic relationships in your life and figure out how you can extract yourself from them. I'm currently on a social media fast. I happened to watch the movie The Social Dilemma. And if you haven't seen that, you definitely should. But it prompted me to want to do a social media fast, which given the political climate has been really beneficial for my self-care. I needed to unplug from all of that, all of the vitriol that's out there. So talking to friends, journaling, you know, petting your dog or your cat, you know, or your furry pillow or whatever. You know, those are all things that we need to do to preserve ourselves. But again, the action plan is really important. Being an ally and supporting, practicing those micro affirmations, and then just using the tools that we have can be really helpful to combat them. Remember that it's so important not to dismiss somebody's experience. That's a micro invalidation, and you're feeding into the same situation. And so, you know, trying to be helpful by saying things, oh, it's no big deal, they didn't really mean it, is totally invalidating to the person receiving them. So be mindful of how you respond so that you're not unintentionally invalidating somebody's experience. So just a reminder, you know, diversity and inclusion are really two terms that we are throwing out widely, but diversity is about what we have and inclusion is what we do. And I like to be more in the action-oriented space. So how can we, as a community, create more inclusive practices and to welcome everyone's experience, welcome all that diversity?
So the main reason I wanted to join was to see what are some of the microaggressions that students generally encounter. Unfortunately, when I ask questions like that, I discover some things haven't changed over the decades and they're still very inappropriate. But on the other hand, some things do change, or maybe my mind just needs to be, you know, enlightened.
Does anyone have a microaggression that they can think of that they would like to share?
Yeah, so one of the most common ones, I bet everybody has experienced them, is when people say guys for like a general group of people that includes women. I probably experience that like once a week. And it's very micro, but it's easily solved by just saying like, hey everyone,
People.
you know, yeah, there's so many like inclusive terms you can use, but people just are always saying like okay, guys. And sometimes they'll say like, okay, guys, and Natalie. And I don't know if I like that anymore, you know? It kind of calls me out.
And in Texas, it's so easy. You can just say y'all, and
Exactly.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
I think y'all should be a term that is universally used. Y'all is everybody, and all y'all includes all the pets in the room.
That's right.
I just don't get why we fight that one. The thing that is really problematic about the hey guys is I've seen women use it in a room full of women.
Hmm.
I've seen people use it in a room with non-binary, and so it really is exclusive language that is, you, especially in a room where it's all engineers. Hey, engineers.
I was gonna just kind of going off what Natalie said. I actually have a professor, and like his word is guys. Like he says it every single sentence, like, okay, guys, let's get started, guys. Let's go, guys. You with me, guys? I'm kind of like, is there even any way to address that if that's literally like his word? Like I guess personally it doesn't super bother me, but like you said, you never know who's in the room. So I feel like maybe bringing it to his attention would be helpful, but I'm not sure it would matter.
Yeah, so I don't know how gutsy you are, and the problem is this kind of comes into a power play. Because when I started work, there was a term worse than guys, and that would be sweetie. It was okay to address women as sweetie, even your boss, which today, I know you're looking at me like, and so it's sad. Hey guys was common back then. Actually, it would be hey men. I think people switched to hey guys as their way to go more neutral, which I find funny. They went from men to guys to prove how neutral they were. And so what I did with the sweetie thing was I just started responding back, yes, sweetie pie. And that would shock them because it was not appropriate to call men terms of endearment, but it was women. And so it's like, well, if you're doing me a term of endearment, obviously we have a relationship that I wasn't aware of. And I did that for 1 week. And at the end of 1 week, the guys were so uncomfortable with being called sweetie pie at work by a woman, they all stopped because they knew I was going to come back at them with sweetie pie. And I wasn't sure if it would work, but I got offensive the day my boss, who was actually a good boss, did it. Because he had never had a female engineer. He'd had female techs who he called sweetie, which again, very inappropriate. But, so he thought I was his star performer, and yet he was calling me sweetie. So maybe calling your prof, hey gals, so after he said it one time, like 5 times in a row, and again, I don't know this professor, so some professors might be offended, but everybody might crack up if you started constantly saying, hey gals, wanted to, come back at you and see what you think. And then all of a sudden they realize how funny it sounds. And then, because he may just need a go-to word.
I think going off of what Stephanie said, I think it's also when facing microaggression, one of the points was own your own thoughts. I think, like one, of course, is to acknowledge our bias, but if you're the one, having the microaggression being done on, I think it's very important to also be confident about the hurt that you feel. Because if you look at literature, somehow women's concerns women are called hypochondriac. Have you ever heard, literature books ever call a man a hypochondriac? No, right?
Yeah.
So there's this, I don't know, hundreds of years of neglecting women's feelings or talking about it as if it's insignificant or we are making a big deal out of it. So I think when you feel that pinprick of hurt or you feel like your boundaries are being violated, I think it's really important to own that as well and realize, hey, because microaggressions are small, right? So sometimes you may not feel confident in thinking, you might think, am I making a big deal out of it? No one else seems to have reacted. But I think in combating microaggression, I think you have to be confident about yourself and say, hey, this really hurt and I really want to bring this up. And the first time when you do it, the first time when you bring up, what you said is really hurtful, it might really, you might feel nervous, you might feel shaky, but the more that you do it, the more confident you are. I think it'll get easier. So the microaffirmation, slide, I think you can do that for yourself as well. Write it down when you have that shaky feeling, write down your qualities and say, my feelings are valid. I am valid in feeling hurt by this non-exclusive term.
Hi,
Yeah.
everyone.
Hi, Sandy, go ahead.
Hey. So basically, I recently launched an organization under Women in Engineering. It's called Electrical Longhorn Ladies in Engineering. I'm a third-year PhD student. And one of the things that I noticed is that, so the goal and the mission basically of the organization is actually like to empower women and to have them become the leaders and like fearless and just there because they deserve to be there. And sometimes what I feel like the feedback is that I get a lot of good feedback from the professors, like especially from the female professors. Like one of the meetings that we had, basically the majority were professors and we have a couple of students. And what I noticed is that like the professors there, because they have been through all of this kind of heartache, like the stuff that has to do with saying guys, for instance, or like sometimes people like, oh, you're such a feminist, or like trying to attack you as if like there's something bad, or like as if like you're exaggerating by saying, okay, wait, because I mean, if somebody says like, hey guys, and I'm in a certain, for example, in classroom, if I pointed it out to the professor, I might be like scolded or be like, are you serious? Like, it's not a big deal. Like, why are you saying that? Because in their minds, like, since I don't know how many generations, we've been looked at, as you were saying, as the people that are there, but not as people as that they have to make like room for or space for, like to acknowledge our existence in that platform or an area. So I think like changing these like small, from the micro messages to the big messages, it's gonna take them a long time for them to adjust. And also some of them, they'll be like, oh, because you're a woman, that's why you're hired, because you're a woman. We are also being attacked over this idea, and all that we're talking about is no, not because we're women, it's because we are as smart, if not smarter. So like we're gonna get so much attack, even like if we're trying to make this tiny change. But I think like because we're changing an ideology, like something that has been there and like for a very long time. So
There's also the fear, if you have been the one in power forever, you feel like your power is being eroded. And there's a great quote out there, a great concept of, equal rights doesn't mean you have less.
Yeah.
And that's a really difficult concept for people who are in power to wrap their brain around, because they feel like, well, equal means less for me.
Yeah.
And
unfortunately, and I think like the male ego comes into place in a lot of scenarios. And because like we were kind of like repressed, and now we have like the women in engineering, we have all of these organizations that are actually saying, no, a female can actually expand her horizon. She can get her own house, she can get her own car, she doesn't need that kind of, the whole thing of like having a male run everything in life. That's actually scares them, because like we're kind of being completely independent and changing this thing around. So yeah.
Thank you all. Hopefully you found this helpful.